Our next speaker is DeMaster, who is active in the gay and lesbian community and has a connection with Women's Resource Center and also with the Outside In.
So I came to Portland in 1970, and I had come out in Madison, Wisconsin about 4 years earlier than that, and that relationship in Madison had ended poorly, and I thought if I came all the way across the country out here to Oregon, I could leave that bad gay stuff behind me in Madison, and I would be able to start over in Portland, and I wouldn't have to be gay. It didn't exactly work that way. It began to work that way. Right, it didn't even begin. It did begin to work that way, but it didn't actually work that way. So when I think back about the 1970s, I think about the 70s as a time before I had I have now two children. It's before I had the children. My children are now 26 and 29 years of age, so it was a long time ago for me, and my relationship with my partner now for 31 years started in the 70s. Joan Cook and I have been together for 31 years. So the 70s were a very tumultuous and life-changing time for me. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit now is my experience of the 20s, but of the 70s, but remembering that at that point I was in my 20s, and I had moved here from someplace else. Just out of curiosity, how many other people have moved here to Portland from someplace else? How many people were in their 20s in the 70s? Not quite as many. But I think for a lot of us here in Portland now, particularly in the gay community, we moved here from someplace else, and that's part of our experience, is making Portland a new home for us and a safe home for us. In thinking about the 70s, I want to go back to what Dave was saying, is that to me anyway, the gay liberation movement in Portland really drew its strength from the civil rights movement, which many people had worked in, and from the anti-war movement. I think we moved beyond that, but clearly that strength and the victory that was celebrated when Nixon resigned was a strong sense of we can do it, we can make a difference if we just come together. And that was part of what was the gay liberation movement anyway for me. The 70s, clearly the 1970s in particular, were a time when feminism began, when gay liberation began, and kind of as a fluke, I think all of us began coming to Portland. So it was a time when Portland, kind of a small Pacific Northwest city, all of a sudden had an influx of people who were all in their 20s, many of whom were either gay or interested in being gay. So for me, being a lesbian in my 20s, when I think about, kind of what were the 70s like, I think it was the same for lesbians as it was for everybody else. It was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Now, come on, it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. At least for me, it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But beyond sex, drugs, and rock and roll, I think for many people, including me, it was the first time that it was okay to be gay. It was a feeling where not only was it okay, it was a good thing to be gay. And it was an experience that was a total transformation for me and for many other people to say, it was okay, it was a good thing to be a lesbian. It wasn't in the general community okay to be gay, but at least in our small community, it was okay. And I think what we kind of went about doing in a very methodical, productive, and successful way is building our own community so that it was okay for us to continue to be gay. So what I think we experienced is that, particularly with the civil rights movement beginning to have success, with the anti-war movement beginning to have success, we wanted, as lesbians anyway, to achieve the American dream, to achieve that same kind of success, and we believed that we could do it. And we sort of said at that time, we are no longer going to be marginalized, and we started creating our own institutions, and that's the part of this that I want to talk about very briefly tonight. And our culture, anyway, for me, the lesbian culture was one of collectives and cooperatives. So what did collectives and cooperatives mean? It meant you had to go to a lot of meetings. Meeting after meeting after meeting. So we formed these collective and cooperatives, we formed them, and then we were the volunteers that got them to work. But it it meant that we also had to have other jobs at the same time in order to support ourselves. And then another influence, nothing like the Civil War movement or the anti-war movement, but another influence came in that I think affected us in Portland, which was CETA, the Concentrated Employment and Training Act. And for many, I mean, it's pretty obscure now. People are frowning, what was that? But if you were there in the 70s, it was the Concentrated Employment and Training Act meant that we could get paid for doing the work that we wanted to be doing, that we were doing already. Particularly, I think, gay women. I don't know if it's as true for gay men, but certainly gay women could be paid for the work that we wanted to do and the work we wanted to do to make the revolution go forward. So the only catch was we had to, instead of had collectives, we now had to have nonprofit organizations that turned into 501c3 tax-exempt organizations. So we did. The first agencies that at least I became in contact were the child care agencies. St. John's Child Care, that is now Peninsula Child Care, Children's Club, and Alder Circle. And I was part of Children's Club in about 1970 to 73. And what was important about Children's Club was that we had been told all along that gay people, lesbians, could not be teachers. But we started these child care centers and said we could be teachers and we could be good teachers. And it was a demonstration to ourselves and to everybody else. Almost as important is in the civil rights movement and in the anti-war movement, it was very clear that we were important in the movement. But we were important for making the coffee, making the copies, sweeping the floor. Women were important behind the scenes. The child care centers allowed us to run the operation, to run the nonprofit agencies. A number of these agencies did, where we finally got experience at leadership and running organizations and making organizations work the way they should. So it was the first time experience for us, for a lot of people, of operating organizations and having control of organizations. It was also the first time that many of us, people like me, who came from the Midwest, dealt with issues in a very real way of racism, of classism, of people with differing abilities. We learned criticism, self-criticism. We were not always very kind to each other, but we did try and learn from our mistakes. We were not very kind to each other many times. Other sets of organizations like that were the domestic violence organizations with Prescott House that developed into Bradley Angle House, the Rape Crisis Line that eventually turned into the Portland Women's Crisis Line. There were alternative collectives like auto repair, electricians, carpenters. There were a lot of organizations that didn't survive but really changed people's lives, like Mountain Moving Cafe, Community Law Project, the Women's Bookstore, the Women's Resource Center, the Lesbian Organizing Project, Every Woman's Company. Does anybody have their Every Woman's Company card anymore? I want my card back. It was the only organization where you could actually come to a meeting and you probably would go home with somebody else, but at least you had to. There were organizations that lasted, like the Metropolitan Community Church and like Outside In. And I will kind of finish up here, but I do want to say, like, about Outside In, it was one of those organizations that really taught us how to run organizations. For me, anyway, I came in 1970. I was working at the Health Sciences Center, and the Health Sciences Center at that time, for me, as a psychologist said, there's only one way to treat women who have depression. That is, give them massive amounts of drugs. And I knew that wasn't right, but I didn't know what was right. So we started a counseling center that was part of Outside In to help us figure out, well, we didn't know ahead of time, but what was right and what could we offer to people that had mental illness or people that had depression that would say, you didn't have to accept what they were telling you anymore. And I think Outside In, now with Kathy Oliver as its director, is still saying you don't have to accept what they say anymore. You can forge a new reality for yourself.